Jim Bridger, Part 7. Stories of frontier life filled that night until the wee small hours. The experience of this first night was repeated every night of our 8 days' journey from Julesburg to Fort Kearny. Nothing could be more vividly shown the esteem in which Mr. Jim Bridger was held by frontiersmen of that time. But before proceeding further, allow me to give you an idea of the personal appearance of this remarkable man. More than 50 years have passed since the incidents here related were imparted to me. Bridger was at that time 56 years of age, well preserved for a man who had passed through many trials and hardships. While I myself am now well advanced in years, I still retain in memory, I believe, a very correct picture of Bridger at the time of which I speak. Of well-proportioned form, of slender mold, about 6 feet high, probably a little less, possibly a trifle more, straight as an Indian and quick in movement, but not nervous or excitable. In weight, probably 160 pounds, with an eye as piercing as the eye of an eagle that seemed to flash fire when narrating an experience that had called out his reserve power. There was nothing in his costume or deportment to indicate the heroic spirit that dwelt within, simply a plain, unassuming man, but made of heroic stuff every inch. What would I not give if I could at this time recall all that was imparted to us during those 8 days of travel in our snug quarters in the wagon train? For it was here that he unfolded day by day the story of his life of 44 years in the great, almost unknown West. He related to us that as a young man he spent his winters in trapping and his summers in exploration. These excursions made him familiar with a vast region, then comparatively unknown. On these trips he chose to go alone, with no companion save his faithful horse, his trusty rifle, and a small hatchet forged from the best of steel. He was always provided with an ample supply of powder and bullets, the former carried in waterproof packages. On one of these excursions, he headed north into the British possessions, and with the North Star for a guide, continued on his way down the valley of the Mackenzie River to the Arctic Ocean. Here, at the very threshold of the Arctic night, he could go no further, and so, turning back, he made his way to his starting point, which he reached after an absence of 18 months. During which time he had not looked into the face of a white man or tasted bread. In time, he found himself on a trail over which he had traveled when a boy, and selecting a place in the mountains not far distant from Salt Lake, he settled down and became a trader with the Indians in the country round about. Business prospered from the start, so Bridger related to us. Soon his little trading place was doing a thriving barter. The furs obtained from the Indians were dispatched on pack animals to St. Joe, Missouri, and goods suitable for exchange were brought back in return. Fremont thus found Bridger on his way to California and spent a few days with his party, resting here before entering on the journey across the barren land west of the Great Salt Lake. Brigham Young and his party were guests in 1847. I cannot recall the date, but Bridger was finally taken with a longing to see the old home, and having an extra large accumulation of pelts, concluded to take charge of them himself. The most valuable part of the cargo was 5,000 beaver skins, which he expected to sell for $4 each. What was his surprise and gratification upon arriving at St. Joe to find beaver skins in great demand at $7 per pelt. He easily disposed of his beaver at that figure, taking $35,000. This was augmented $5,000 by the proceeds from other pelts in his possession, aside from beaver skins, thus putting into his hands $40,000, a princely sum of money at that time for a young man born at most in the wilderness. Bridger was pleased with the quiet life in the East, and having abundant ready money, bought a large tract of land, married, and as he supposed, settled down to the quiet life of a farmer. But the call of the wild was not to be hushed, and in a few years he was back among his previous familiar scenes, returning at times to visit his family, but not remaining long. While at Fort Laramie, this story was told me of Bridger. For many years before the Union Pacific Railroad penetrated the country, Fort Laramie was the terminus of transit travel, and visitors of this kind were not plentiful, as means of travel were limited to the mail wagon that made weekly trips to Julesburg, 180 miles distant. Globetrotters and ambitious young newspaper correspondents made up the larger part of visitors. The latter were the bane of Bridger's life. He was naturally reserved, and his interviewers of this class were persistent. One youngster made himself, particularly obnoxious to the old man. And finally, with a grim sense of humor, the old scout proceeded to romance with his inquisitor. In answer to the question whether any important changes had occurred in the country since he had known it, owing to earthquakes or other natural phenomena, old Jim pointed out Laramie Peak and gravely remarked that where the mountain then stood was a yawning chasm when he first knew the locality. And in reply to questions regarding petrifications, Bridger further stated that he had visited a place where there was a petrified mountain on which stood forests of petrified trees, and in their branches were petrified birds, while petrified songs projected from their throats. All of this was duly swallowed and taken down by the Knight of the Pencil. Another laughable incident was related to me by Bridger himself. Soon after he was employed as official guide by the government, he was sent with an exploring party into the Bighorn Mountains. There was quite a party of wagons, pack animals, and a squad of cavalry, all under the command of a young officer fresh from West Point. All went well until the expedition reached the Bighorn River, swollen at the time from melting snows. When Bridger suggested the plan for crossing the turbulent stream, he was curtly told that he was only employed as guide. With this, the fresh young West Pointer ordered two of the mounted men to ride in and fasten a line to the opposite shore. The horses lost their footing in the swift current, and one of the men was drowned. Then, in humiliation, the West Point youth appealed to Bridger and implored him to take the crossing in hand. This Bridger agreed to do, but admonished the youngster to retire to his tent and remain there until called for. To describe in detail the provisions made for crossing the stream, while interesting, would prove a long story. First, a crude boat was constructed of poles and willows. This was covered with some heavy canvas and made waterproof by a liberal application of pitch, prepared from gum gathered from the spruce and pine trees. The men then stripped and on horseback succeeded in crossing with a line, and with this dragged the cable ashore, which was made fast to a large tree. All hands then stretched the cable and made it fast on the side where the party awaited, with the boat secured to the cable by a slip noose. And all were safely carried across the river, the young officer being the last of all. And here comes the laughable part of the story. The first thing the youngster did on being restored to his command was to call on the chaplain to assemble the expedition and return thanks to Providence for the safe crossing. Here, Bridger's eyes sparkled as he told how that chaplain fell on his knees and in a loud voice thanked the Lord God of hosts for bringing the troops over in safety. And darn his sanctimonious skin, old Jim concluded to me in recounting the story, he never mentioned Bridger once, and I felt as if I had had something to do with that plan myself. On parting with Bridger at Fort Kearny, we reluctantly had to refuse his invitation to accompany him home, and now, after the lapse of over 50 years, I often think of passages in Bridger's life as related on that memorable journey, and when I listen to these modern-day scouts who have explored the Rocky Mountains in Pullman cars and ranged them beside such a man as Jim Bridger, they appear as mice in the company of a lion. End of Part 7.